So we're talking about the performative theory of identity, and I've been looking at Bojack performing as a professor as my central example of that. But there are other examples of performance and identity that we need to talk about in this season. One cute little one is when Bojack realizes that he's alienated from horses and he wants to go try to find himself by reconnecting with other horses. But what he does is he goes and experiences a fake, performed, reconstructed religious horse ceremony, which is right, oldie-timey from a different era. And somehow he finds meaning in it anyway. But it's clear that it's not only a performance, but we're told explicitly that it's an iterative performance, because at the end, the fake pastor says to him, "Stay if you like, in 30 minutes we start over," right? So this is a performance that will happen over and over again. It's an acting performance of real community rather than a real community. And it's kind of interesting that Bojack seems to find meaning in it anyhow. I'm not sure quite what to make of that, but it's clearly drawing on Judith Butler that scene is even included. But the other place where performativity and identity comes up really vividly that I want to spend much more time on is when it comes to Diane and her depression and her attempt to write her memoirs, right? Diane is struggling with real depression, and at the same time, Mr. Peanut Butter, who doesn't seem to be depressed at all, has become the official performed face of depression, right? So one quick point to make is that for Mr. Peanut Butter, depression is certainly and explicitly just performative. Back to Diane, though. Diane is struggling for several episodes over whether the real her, the true Diane, is the depressed version of herself or the version of herself on medication, which is not depressed anymore, right? When she has medication and is able to function, she feels like she's just performing a self and performing normalcy, and that isn't the real her. But arguably, depression is an illness that breaks us in various ways and keeps us from being our real selves, right? Especially if you do believe in some version or other of a narrative or a performative theory of identity. Depression fragments our ability to sustain and perform a narrative. And so you could argue that what depression does is gets in the way of us being our real selves. I think, again, the show is ambiguous on purpose, and we could see it either way. You could think of depression as the thing that impedes you being yourself, or you could think of medication that alters your awareness as being the thing that impedes you from being your real self. Or, and this is the one that's most in keeping with the ongoing themes of the show, you might think, look, there's no answer to that question. There is no such thing as a real self. Both of those are real to the extent that they are what you're doing and what you're in the midst of. And there's no answer to the question, what's the real self like, independent of its depression or independent of its medication? The real self is just whatever self there is. Indeed, Bojack says this to Diane, right? And it's a real moment where we understand that he has gotten a better existential understanding of himself. Diane gives that heartbreaking speech about how on the inside she's nothing, that there's just a nothingness, and she's worried that the nothing is her real self. And Bojack says, look, there is no real self on the inside. The nothing isn't any realer than anything else, right? He says that there's no real inner essential self and that change is possible. So if she feels like nothing, then she should just do something different. The nothingness doesn't have any deep reality the way that Diane's depression is telling her that it does. Anyhow, so yeah, it's an interesting question to think about with medication and depression. To what extent does illness let the real self come out, and to what extent does it hide it? And to what extent does medication let the real self come out, or to what extent does it hide it? Or maybe we want to think of medication as just making you functional enough to allow you to actually build a new self that works. Diane seems to believe that if she doesn't write from a place of pain and suffering and chaos, then her writing isn't real or it isn't worthwhile. And I think this is a common idea, right? This idea that in order to create something real and important, you have to suffer. But why do we think this? Why do we value suffering in this way? It's a question that I'm not going to try to answer, but you might want to try to think about that, right? What is it that makes us think that a product that comes out of suffering is realer or more valuable than a product that does not? Is the lighthearted book that she writes in the end that doesn't come out of suffering once she has medication, the story of Ivy who fights crime, is that lighter book less valuable the way she thinks it is than the book that would have been produced out of suffering? This is a question she really struggles with. Her boyfriend's son, Sonny, finds real value in the lighter book, right? It's not clear why we should believe that creativity and meaning require darkness and pain. Incidentally, I think that this is a question that the maker of the show is asking himself in a real way. You know, he's made this very dark show. Does it need to be dark in order to be important? The episodes of Bojack that are lighter-hearted and funny and less serious, does that make them less valuable? It's an important question that I think he's struggling with. In any case, what does all of this have to do with narrativity and performativity? Well, I want to think about the episode Good Damage, the one where she's struggling with writer's block, which I think is one of the most powerful episodes of the show, although there are a lot of contenders. One thing that's interesting about this is that the different forms of drawing in this episode represent Diane's inner life and the inner shape of her thinking and feeling. And we can see through how the drawings progress what role the antidepressants play, right? And notice that once she goes on antidepressants, the form of her thought solidifies. It stops jumping around and it becomes more stable, and the colors get filled in and the lines get completed. We can compare this with the rhythm point that I made about episode 2, the new client episode, where we see Princess Carolyn's inner life and rhythm. And we can see through how the rhythm is represented visually, how her inner life is congealing or fragmenting. Similarly, I think what we see here is that when Diane is depressed, her inner life doesn't come together into anything that has a definite shape or a definite narrative to it. One way we might read depression is that what depression does is it fragments the self, and it keeps us from unifying that self into a narrative whole. And of course, if you can't unify yourself into a whole, then you also can't perform yourself as having a unified identity. One of the things that performance can do is it can help you find that unity, right? The performance can make there be a kind of unity that there wasn't there, right? We can act as if we have a definite identity, and in acting as if we have a definite identity, we can come to have one. But depression, at its worst, can block that kind of performance. It can fragment us on the inside and the outside so that we can't actually enact the social rituals and the meaningful behaviors that we need to enact in order to have an identity that makes sense. And if that's true, then depression is actually the thing that undermines our identity, not the thing that shows off our true identity. And Diane, while she's struggling with depression and writer's block, herself feels disunified to herself. Her actual sentences don't even come together. We see on the inside how she is speaking in sentence fragments and ungrammatical chunks, lots of interruptions. Why does she care so much about producing a written book? Why does it matter to her so much that she be able to write something? Well, one thing I would suggest, getting back to Judith Butler, is that she feels like if she can get public uptake and recognition for having a unified identity, then she will actually have one. So if she can manage to write her own life narrative in a way that makes sense and that other people can read and recognize, then that will be a way of giving herself that narrative, of making it real through performance, and that will give her back the self that she thinks she's missing. At the same time, during this episode, we have this thesis of good damage, right? This idea that Princess Carolyn gives her, that sometimes being damaged and fragmented eventually will turn you into a stronger and more unified self than simply having been unified and undamaged all along. But remember the metaphor. It's that the bowl shatters and then is put back together again. So the damage is fine. The damage might make you more interesting. The fragmentation might make the eventual self more worthwhile, but it has to be put back together again. And the way it's put back together again for Diane is through writing. She has to write this book, she feels like. Otherwise, any damage that she's undergone was pointless, and any way that depression has undermined her is pointless. It's not good damage. It's the product, the writing that other people can read and recognize, that justifies all of the pain that she's undergone, or so she thinks. Right? Interestingly, Diane feels, when she's talking about her writer's block, like she has multiple narratives, but she doesn't have an overarching narrative. Right? She says, I have so many stories to tell, but I can't figure out what the book is. In other words, she can't figure out the one thing that draws all these stories together. And so she's worried that what she has is not the good kind of fragmentation, which can then come back together into a whole, but the bad kind of fragmentation that just leaves her without a narrative identity. In terms of this thesis of good damage, and going back to Bojack's character, right? If selves can be fragmented and put back together in this way, that Princess Carolyn suggests they can, and that Diane comes to think that they can, maybe. This doesn't bode well for Bojack in a way, because if so, then the past pieces of himself that have broken off, they're still him, right? They are the pieces that have to be glued back into him before he can be whole. He doesn't get to just shed them. He has to incorporate them. So anyhow, we have what I think is a combination here in Diane of the narrative theory of identity and the performative theory of identity, which is her identity will be real even though it's fragmented, if and only if she can write it up as a unified single narrative, express it to other people, and have other people read it and give her uptake for it. So the good kind of damage is the kind of damage that enables you to later perform a unified, interesting narrative. The bad kind of damage is the kind of damage that leaves you just unable to come up with any unified narrative at all, either internally or in performance. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That was a rich pile of stuff for us to think about.